Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the AAS YouTube channel. And this is part of the good stuff. This is the Sky and Telescope author series. And I'm very happy to have Ken Hewitt-White with us today. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Frank.
How you doing today?
Well, doing as well as could be expected. We're heading into a winter storm. Our viewers should know that we're recording this on the day of the winter solstice in 2020.
Right.
So it's the first day of winter, and it's appropriate because in my neck of the woods, we're right now in the middle of a terrific rainstorm. That's going to the temperature is actually going down as the day goes through instead of up. Where a cold front is expected here about in the hour or so, and then it's going to snow.
What is your geolocation?
I'm located in a little city of about just under 100,000 people called Chilliwack in southern British Columbia. I'm about a 90-minute drive east of Vancouver, BC, which of course is right on the Pacific coast.
Yep.
And then stretching from Vancouver eastward to where I am is the Fraser Valley, which is all pretty much at sea level and very much under the influence of the Pacific. So throughout the winter, we get a lot of Hawaiian weather that's cooled off by the time it gets here, but loaded with rain. We get a lot of damp, rainy weather November through March. So I'm about a 90-minute drive, 100 kilometers east of Vancouver, but I'm also about the same distance west of the mountains of the Coast Range. So from my location, if I'm looking to do some stuff in the big city, I'm not too far away. And if I go in the other direction and keep going east, I'm going up into the mountains to my favorite observing sites, which are up around 4,000 or 5,000 feet.
Cool.
And nice and dark. So yeah, I'm in a not too bad spot. Although I wouldn't say that today. Today's an awful day. And I'm envious of the fact that you're in Arizona where the sky is blue. So there.
Sky is blue. It will be about 60 F or so high today.
And so tonight you'll be able to see the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, where
Right.
you are. Where I am, I'll just read about it.
Yeah, I'm actually planning on going out with my wife. We'll go out around 5:30 or so, and take a look at the conjunction. So we've got a double whammy. We've got solstice and the conjunction going on. So very cool.
Well, we're not missing the solstice. We're getting it full bore, but I'll miss the conjunction. But this cold front will bring in clear sky. So we'll see Jupiter and Saturn tomorrow night.
They'll still be close together. They may not be close together, but very close. So cool. So Ken, you mentioned your observing site and stuff. What do you like to do in astronomy?
Well, like anybody else, I like to get out of town when I can. Up here in BC, just north of the 49th parallel, we have some pretty serious winter situations like people in the northern United States. So I'm at home most of the time in the winter. In the summer, I like to get up on the mountains and observe. I have an 18-inch Dobsonian, which somehow fits in the back of my car, and we head off to our whatever observing site that works for us on that particular occasion. And I'm interested I've always been interested in the deep sky. And during the dark of the moon, me and my observing colleagues get out into the interior. We have two major star parties each summer that accommodate hundreds of observers. One of them is, I'm going to brag about this, it's the Mount Cobo Star Party. This is our Mount Cobo t-shirt.
Awesome.
Isn't that neat?
That is
and the current sad news about I think this is true for star parties all over the place, is that so many of them got canceled this past summer because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So we weren't able to go to our usual retreat for a week during the dark of the moon in August. My friends and I, we reserved some rooms at a fishing lodge in the interior that was open in August. You had to book it in advance. We got a cabin that was next to an open field for our telescope. When we got there, it was cloudy the whole time. Almost. It was very frustrating. Anyway, I love getting out into the interior with my larger scope and doing lots of deep sky stuff, and particularly with regard to galaxies and galaxy clusters. That's something that greatly interests me. And I've been writing about this stuff for Sky and Tell since about 1998, I think was my first deep sky column.
Okay.
So it's been about 22 years that I've been doing that. And then in the wintertime, I'm stuck at home. And something that's developed just in the last 7, 8 years is my one of my closest observing colleagues and a consulting editor for Sky and Tell, Gary Saronic. He and I have conspired together to create columns that deal with backyard astronomy. If you're stuck at home in the city, in a suburb with a lousy sky, um, but still able to see something, can
Yeah.
we write about it? Can we describe what you can do in the backyard with a little? I call it guerrilla of urban astronomy, where you develop all sorts of tactics to deal with unwanted effects like lights and smoke from chimneys and that sort of thing, and unwanted intruders like raccoons in the middle of the night crawling around, and skunks crawling on the base of my telescope. Oh dear. But a lot of my focus, if you'll pardon the play on words, a lot of the focus of my astronomy and my writing over the last fair number of years has been suburban astronomy, trying to do what we can with it rather than ignoring it. And then in the summertime, I do what everybody else does, and I hit the highway and get out of town.
And in fact, we're going to cover your January Suburban Stargazer article when we get to two of your pieces here today. So I'm always curious how people come to astronomy. So you mentioned you've been writing for Sky and Tell for at least 22 years. Presumably you got into astronomy before then. So how did you get into astronomy?
Well, I go back a long way. Um, um, how long ago was it that the dinosaurs were on Earth? I go back about halfway, I think. When I was a little kid, growing up in the 1960s,
Okay.
back in Ontario, I grew up in Canada's capital city, Ottawa, and my friend across the road, his folks had a cottage a couple hours drive out of town, and Dave was my best friend, and they invited me along to the cottage, and we would go fishing and do and swimming, the things that little kids do. And it was 1963. It was a total solar eclipse that year, not that far away from where we were. It was about an 80% partial eclipse at the cottage. Naturally, it rained all day, got very dark, and we watched the eclipse on television, black and white TV in the 1960s.
Yes.
And what happened? I think I was developing an interest in the night sky anyway. I was writing science reports in school, seventh grade, eighth grade, about the planets and stuff like that. But at the cottage, this actually happened. That before going to bed at night, you had to go out to the outhouse, and do what you had to do. And it was dark. And as luck would have it, we were there at the cottage during a time when there was no moon in the sky. If there had been a moon, I'm not sure that the story would have turned out the same. It's so light outside, maybe you don't pay attention to the sky.
Mm-hmm.
But the moon was not there. It was dark and it was clear. And I went out to the outhouse and I came back out and I looked up and there was the night sky full of stars in the Milky Way. And it was awesome. And I just stood there. I was 10 years old or something.
Mm-hmm.
Dave's mom comes up the back door of the cottage. She says, "Ken, are you out there? You've been eaten up by a bear or something?" And I said, "I'm looking at the stars." And
Cool.
yeah, so it's all in the early to mid 60s. And then I got my first telescope, a little refractor telescope in the fall of 65.
Okay.
I just heard about the great comet of Kiyosaki
Yep.
in a paper, but didn't know where to look, didn't know what I was doing, didn't see it. So I got a telescope. And I started working my way through the sky with that little telescope and my dad's binoculars. He lent me his binoculars. He never got them back. He never saw them again. They were mine after that.
Usurped.
I explored, and then for a couple of years, I just went on. And I can't tell you how I heard about Sky and Telescope. Well, it must have been because of the the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, which I joined in early 1967, and so I was going to meetings, and I guess I must have seen the magazine there. I took out a subscription right away, and my first subscription, my first issue of Sky and Tell was in January of 1967. It arrived on my birthday in the middle of January, just turned 16. And on the front cover of Sky and Tell were these a collage of pictures from the great Leonid meteor storm of November 1966, which was seen to great effect in your state at Kitt Peak, which was still a brand new installation at the time, and with reports from there and other places where it was clear. And of course, the pictures on the front cover of Sky and Tell in 1967 were anything like the pictures you can get now. It was amazing that even with the meteors raining down at thousands and thousands per hour for a brief period of time, they were just catching a few meteors in each picture.
Yeah.
Anyway, that galvanized my interest. I read that issue from front to back and then from back to front, upside down and sideways. I would open up the issue every night before going to bed. And then the astronomy club got in touch with me and said, how would you like to come out to our country observatory and we'll do some meteor watching in the summer. We'll watch the Perseus shower. So I got very interested in meteor observing that way. And little did I know, I want to tell you just how happy I am to be part of Sky and Telescope after all these years, because that was a turning point in my life. In January of 1967, as a young kid, a teenager, a lot of kids my age were getting into trouble. And they're,
Yeah.
we all know what was happening in the 1960s in the summer of love and so on.
Yep.
Well, I fell in love. I fell in love with the night sky, and Sky and Tell was a big part of that. And it was only 10, what was it, 10, 12 years later that I wrote my first little bit for the magazine. I was asked to do a book review for on Burning Celestial Handbook. I think it was 1978. And I did a series of reviews on the 3 volumes of that, and then another review on Sky Atlas 2000 when it came out in the mid 80s, I think. And
Yes.
then started writing upbeat sky stuff. So here we are all these years later. I'm still doing it. A grizzled veteran.
That is awesome. That is awesome. You also have that wouldn't happen to be your dad's binoculars behind you there, would it?
Those are no, those are my dad's little 7x35s. Just very quickly, I wrecked my dad's binoculars. I used them to learn the sky until my telescope arrived. Back in those days, you couldn't just go and buy a telescope. I had to order it from the Laurentian Trading Post in suburban Ottawa, and it took 3 months to arrive. And while I was waiting, I was exploring the sky with binoculars. And then after the telescope arrived, I cannibalized my binoculars. I took out the eyepieces in the telescope were so bad that I took out the eyepiece from the binoculars and used that in the telescope to get a nice wide angle eyepiece. I can't remember what my dad's reaction was to that all these years later. I blocked it out of my memory. But those glasses that you see in the background there, those are 15x70s. And I've been having them on standby on the tripod, perhaps you can see, ready to get a glimpse of the planetary conjunction. Any chance I get, I just grab the binoculars and get outside. And most recently, about 4 or 5 days ago, there was a little crack in the clouds. Honestly, it wasn't more than 3 or 4 degrees across, but we were able to see the planets about 3/4 of a degree apart at that time. And it's fantastic. Little Jupiter is a disk, because these are 15-power binoculars, and the moons and Saturn, and you just barely detect the ring. And so we've been looking forward to seeing the conjunction on, with the 2 planets a lot closer than that. But as I said earlier, we're pretty thoroughly rained out.
Cool. Cool. Well, that's going to start us in on these really lovely Sky and Telescope articles. So do a little screen share here. And the first one of 2 is titled Orion's Club District. And this is from the February of 2021 issue. And we are going to start down here on page 30. Ken, take us away.
One thing I want you to know is that the another telescope that you see in the background, that blue one, that refractor,
Yep.
4-inch refractor, That was the telescope I used to put together some of this column. I used it to observe the star cluster that you see in the image here. Um, this whole project started about I can't remember, 4 or 5 years ago when
What?
I was searching for a comet. That's another thing I like to do. I'm a real comet watcher. I've never discovered one, but I've seen well over 200 comets. And I was searching for a comet in Orion, very faint comet, 10th magnitude or something. And it was up northeastern Orion in an area of sky that I didn't really know all that well. And I just took a wrong turn. Instead of going south, I went north or whatever it was that I did wrong. And in my field of view, I swept up this little clump of stars that you see in the picture. I said, well, what the heck is that? It was very small, but very bright. And it's NGC 2169. Almost right away, I asked myself, how did Charles Messier miss this one? It's like a miniature Pleiades.
Yeah.
And in his little telescope, way back then in the late 18th century, it would look like a little fuzzy clump of stars. And well, he missed a lot of little things here and there, and this was one of them. So anyway, that really got my curiosity worked up, and I checked my star charts when I got inside and figured out what it was. And then slowly it dawned on me that this is a part of Orion that I had never explored before. And like everyone else, I confessed to this at the beginning of the article. Like everyone else, I spent most of my time looking at the Sword of Orion, M42, and when I'm out in the dark countryside, I'm looking at the Horsehead Nebula, or the nebulosity in the Belt of Orion, and M78, and all the rest of it. There's lots of stuff in Southern Orion. But I never, and there's a lovely planetary nebula in the north part of Orion, but that's as far north as I've gone, and I hadn't gone to the northeastern quadrant. So I decided I'm going to work this up, and I'm going to do it from the city. Let's see how much of it we can see.
Okay.
So that was the genesis for this article. It began a long time ago. It wasn't commissioned. I just slowly began to work up the observations, and then eventually there was an opportunity. There was some page space for the February issue, and I pitched the idea to Diana at Science,
Hmm.
and they said, "Yeah, let's do that." And so it begins with this star cluster 2169, which looks a little bigger here on the screen than it does in the telescope. In the little refractor there, the 4-inch refractor, it's very small, but it's a bright clump of stars, and it takes magnification very well. And I started exploring it. And one of the themes that I wanted to we'll talk a little bit more about this as time goes on here. Um, but in this article and in the new bi-monthly series that we're doing in Science, what I try to do is find a series of objects that take us on a tour. So we go through a region of sky, and that's what we're doing here, going through the Club of Orion, that club that he's brandishing, so forcefully in the mythological depiction of the constellation.
Right.
And there are 4 or 5 NGC objects up there. None of them very bright. Let's see how many of them we can see from the city using either a small scope, like we did with the cluster here, or my larger ones. I have the 8-inch reflector, which maybe you can see in the background there, I used, and also my 10-inch reflector. When you get enough aperture going in the city, you can actually punch through the light pollution fairly well, depending on what you're looking at.
Okay.
What I wanted to emphasize is that when you look closely at these things, that you always come up with more stuff to look at. And a good example is in this cluster. Um, the brightest star in the cluster is labeled here as Struve 848, and it has that designation because it's a binary star. And when you look at the cluster, there's no way you'd be aware of that until you start piling on the magnification. And that's another theme that I try to explore in my Suburban articles. I've been guilty of this for much of my observing life. Is you look at a star cluster at low magnification, you look at it for, I don't know, 10 seconds, and then you move on. Whoa, slow down.
Yeah.
Let's take a closer look. Is there anything else you can see inside the cluster? Well,
Yeah.
one of the things I noticed, particularly with my 10-inch reflector, it gathers more light, is that this cluster is all blue. It's a young cluster. These are all hot blue-white stars with a few exceptions around the edges. There's those 2 stars on top of each other. You see them right there, Frank. Those are very yellowy orange stars, and then there's one just to the left of Struve 848. So there's a little bit of color there. And then when you look at 848 itself, well, it turns out to be a binary star. It's very unequal, very tight for a small telescope. It's a close binary, and it's a bit of a challenge to try to resolve it. And I can't do it in the 4-inch refractor. Tried several times, but I can do it in my larger scope. I think the article refers to using my Maxitov Cassegrain. It's 180 millimeter matte cast, and it resolves it no problem. And my 10-inch reflector, no problem. So it's a case of how much telescope you have, how much telescope power do you have to throw at these objects. But when you look closely, sometimes you get pleasant surprises, and that binary star is certainly one. If we move on uh, uh, to backwards in the page count, but forwards in my investigation, I came across this cluster 2194, NGC 2194, which is just a few degrees away from the other cluster. 2194, I did not expect to see. For these fainter clusters, I used just a 10-inch reflector. Well, I tried it with the matte cast, and I could detect them, but really, the 10-inch was the instrument of choice.
Okay.
And I didn't think I would see it. It's a faint NGC, it's 9th magnitude or something, but it does show up in the telescope.
Nice.
You use enough magnification to get in close, make the sky background darker. And once again, by getting in close, I had a pleasant surprise. There is a string of stars that you see connected. There's a connect the dots sequence there heading southwest of the cluster. And this string of stars is actually more prominent in the eyepiece of the telescope than in the picture. The picture picks up so much of the faint stuff that you cannot see in the telescope. But you can see this line of stars that ends in a kind of propeller-shaped asterism at the end.
Kind of like a wall.
And it was a long barbed tail stretching out for some roundish creature, which was the star cluster. In all, it was about 20 arc minutes across, and it filled the field of view of my 10-inch scope at high magnification. But it just was more interesting to look at than I thought. And then when you look at the pictures, you realize that again, it is a cluster, mostly young cluster, but a lot of orange stars in there. The bright stars, the 2194, these look to me like orange giants, possibly red giants. So this might be I didn't check this into this, but this might be a cluster that's evolved along off the main sequence a fair bit, or at least, getting up in years. I haven't looked into the science of it. But it's it's not a groundbreaking, it's not a marquee cluster, but it's observable in the country. For anybody listening into this who has working under a country sky this winter, be sure to look up this cluster. I've never seen it in a country sky. We only get one clear night a year as it is in the winter. In my part, it's not that bad.
I think you hit on a good point. You mentioned earlier is sometimes it takes a little bit more than just a quick 10-second look, right? Slow down.
Yeah, it's taught me a lesson. Find an object and then get in close on it. Maybe there's nothing else to see, but there might well be. I did that with the star cluster, what very well known star cluster in Perseus is M34. And when you apply a bit of magnification M34, you find that it's riddled with doubles, wide ones, tight ones. The more power you throw at it, the more you see. That's not the case with this cluster, but it does have this very interesting string of stars emanating from it. If we go to the next one, in the sequence, I just want to, before I say anything, want to make sure. Yeah, all right. Okay, so now, well, I have to fess up. I mean, I'm really pushing the envelope here. When I did when I went through my star charts in northeastern Orion in the club district, as I call it, I said, I want to try for every NGC that's there. Let's just, maybe I won't see them all. And I saw 2194. Well, this next one, which is located very close to the 4th magnitude star, Mu Orionis, at the bottom. This next cluster really is a toughie. And It's NGC 2141. It's significantly dimmer than the cluster we were just looking at.
Yeah.
And I spent the first 2 nights not seeing it, but also not giving up. And I went after, I just waited for a particularly clear night, a night where there's no haze, no moonlight, no nothing. And late at night, I did this in October, late at night, after midnight, and neighbors' porch lights were off. That's part of my guerrilla astronomy. It's just, I'm constantly skulking around blocking out street lights and
Yeah.
erecting screens, block out porch lights, what have you, and waiting for people to go to bed so that their kitchen lights go off, that type of thing. And I put the 10-inch reflector here and I put it on Mu Orionis, and I started looking for patterns. You'll see this in I hope this will be a constant theme of my new bi-monthly column in the magazine, is that when we look for things difficult to identify objects, look for patterns. Miniature asterisms, kind of stuff that you won't see on the star charts because you're going below the level of the star chart. And so we find that north of Mu Orionis, more than a degree away, is that little triangle. And at the top of the screen, that's easy to see. And I said to myself, well, the cluster is halfway from see it. And then I found the little bent line of stars, the center of which is that guy HC 250956. And I said, that thing will aim right at the cluster and crank up the magnification way high, 200 power, something like that, 150 to 200. Well, guess what? There it is, this little cloud of light is slightly mottled. That's the star cluster. And it framed inside 5 stars in a pentagon, like a little miniature constellation Auriga. And I actually found I noticed the pentagon shape first, and then inside it was this cloudy patch. And I thought, well, I must have breathed on the eyepiece. No, it's the cluster.
That is it.
And as I say in the article, it's pretty thin gruel, but it represents a triumph of sorts. I saw the stupid thing.
Perseverance. Perseverance.
If we move on to the next one, Frank, I wound up with extra time to work on the article, and because I was having success with the clusters, I had one of those why not moments. Why not try for this next thing, which I know is impossible. I'm certain it's impossible. Let's try it anyway. And it's an H2 region, an emission nebula, NGC 2175. This is quite near the top of Orion's club. And I figured, well, in my large aperture Dobsonian, my 18-inch out in the country, yeah, I'll see it out there. But can I see it in the 10-inch? Well, I looked in the telescope, various magnifications, and saw absolutely nothing except the bright star that you see labeled. That's the one that's labeled 42088. That's the brightest. I think that's the star that's illuminating the nebula. I think.
Yeah. I think that's right.
Yeah. And what I did was I said, well, let's throw a filter in, a UHC filter,
okay,
or an oxygen filter. And I did both, and bingo, there it is. In fact, I thought it looked a little better in the UHC. Because my sky is so compromised in the city that the O3 was the image was a little darker than I felt comfortable with. But I could see the nebula, not all of it that you see here, but the inner third of it, I would say. And as I was looking at this thing, I said, I see a pattern of stars, and it's vaguely shaped like the Big Dipper. And I took the filter out, and those stars were easier to see. And then I started to identify doubles. You remember what I said earlier, but let's just get in close and see what you can see. So the little binary star called SCA 37, that was really easy to pick out. And above it, SCA 36, that one was not easy. That one, the star didn't look right, it looked sort of oblong. So I crank up the magnification, and that's a binary. And well, that's kind of fun. And then if you follow the pointer stars of this fake dipper, it takes us over to the left-hand side of the image where there's a star called HD 42333, and right above it is a star cluster. And this star cluster, the notion of an embedded cluster in this nebula is a controversial subject. There's a colander cluster here, officially a colander cluster, that's never been fully identified. Some people think that they can see a smattering of stars in the nebula. Maybe it's my Big Dipper asterism. I don't know.
Hmm.
Uh, but the colander cluster that's supposed to be embedded in the nebula is not something that is widely observable. Let's put it that way. But
Okay.
my Uranometria star atlas charts a cluster associated with this nebula, and it's the one you see on the left, CO 607 plus 206, and it's on the chart. It's plotted on the chart. And I said, well, let's see if the chart is right. Well, the chart is right. There is a cluster there, and it's easy to see. It's a little tiny thing, uh, but you pick it up right away as long as you remove the filter first. But you won't show up if you got an O3 filter in place. And I looked closely at the cluster, magnifying it to see if I could see any faint background stars. And I found out that the brightest member of this cluster, just like with 2169 that we're looking at earlier on, the brightest member of this cluster is a binary, J1922. You need tons of power to see it. I think I used 218 power in my camera, but it's a binary star.
Hmm.
So, you know, you miss out on the glory of this object when you're looking at it from the city, compared to what you see in a photograph, or compared to what you might see through a really nice large Dobsonian in the countryside. But everything that I've marked up in the picture here, you can see, except where it says NGC 2174. Some charts have the nebula misidentified. Some charts you'll see labeled as 74, but it's actually 75 for the entire nebulosity. 74 is a knot of nebulosity inside the main nebula, and that's why we put 2174 where we did.
Okay.
But the other thing that we do see though is that bit of nebulosity right in the center, sharpless 252E. You can see that. Crank up the power, put on your UHC or O3 filter, whatever works best for you,
A binary.
and little details show up. So I have to tell you, I was not knocked out. I really enjoyed observing this thing. It's a threshold object that I never thought I would see anything of interest here at all. I just had some time in my hands. Well, let's aim the telescope there. You don't know until you look, right? And there it is.
Until you look.
So I think the moral of the story is that even when you're observing from the city, you might be just surprised by how much you can see if you just put a little bit of effort into it and look closely and patiently at each object as you go along.
Speaking of, you have this really cool, really lovely new bi-monthly column coming on Suburban Stargazing. The first column came out in January, and so the next one will be coming out, I believe, in March. And so go ahead and take us through the aim and purpose and what you wrote about in your first column here.
Well, I have to tell you, the first disagreement I've had with the editors at Sky and Telescope is that due to my advancing age, I wanted to call this Suburban Stargazer, but we had to settle for Stargazer. uh, I've been doing this for so many decades, but the article we just reviewed in the February issue is it's a good segue into the bi-monthly column because it shows the kinds of themes that I'm interested in. Looking at a combination of objects that we can see from suburban skies, deeply light polluted skies. Looking at brighter objects, but also looking around in that general area at fainter stuff to see. So we've been looking at something easy and something challenging. That's what I'm getting at. And so the first column of our new series um, it deals with Eastern Taurus. I like to keep the fairly small regions. These columns you'll find that they rarely cover an area of sky much more than about 10 or 15 degrees square. try to keep a small area and investigate it closely. And so in this one, we take a close look at the Crab Nebula. This image by our good friend Ron Brecker, whom you interviewed a few weeks ago.
Ah,
And
yes, Ron. Mm-hmm.
our Canadian page. Ron is Canadian as I am. A beautiful image of M1, the Crab Nebula. And I'm one of those people who years ago never bothered with my smaller scope to try looking for the crab from the city. I thought, well, you can't see it. I assumed you could not see it. Well, you can see it. And I not only was I was using my 10-inch telescope for much of the observing that I described in this column, but I also found it in my smaller scope, in my 4.7-inch apochromat.
Okay.
So, basically a 5-inch refractor. I could see the nebula, and it responded very well to a UHC filter. That really helps. Not so much an oxygen filter, because of course the Crab Nebula is not an emission nebula in the regular sense. It is a supernova remnant, and it's not pushing out the same emission lines that we see in, for example, normal planetary nebulae.
Right.
Or H2 regions. So I found that an oxygen filter doesn't really help very much, but the UHC sure does. And our ordinary broadband light pollution filter will also increase the contrast so you can see the cluster. Frank, if we go to the chart that's associated with this article, one thing I like to point out, there we are, there's the chart, is that part of my theme is looking for stuff that's close to the main object. So in this particular case, I was interested in the Crab Nebula, but it turns out there's a couple of double stars very close. The one that you see to the left of the Crab, Strub 742. And although it's not marked in this chart, I think it's marked in this separate close-up chart. Just below 742, there is another double star right near Zeta, and which is very, very easy to see. It's very easily resolved at low magnification. 742 requires a little bit more power, but there's a couple of double stars that you can pick off even as you're tiptoeing your way to the Crab Nebula from Zeta. And again, I've been looking at the Crab Nebula for 40 years. I never bothered to slow down long enough and check, just sweep around the immediate area slowly to see if there's other stuff there. Well, there is. There's these two double stars that I mentioned, and there's a few more just outside the dark blue box in the chart that I didn't mention in the column. The other thing we talked about here are that those two open clusters that you see on the chart to the left of the Hyades, NGC 1647, and its cousin a little further up the way, NGC 1746. And these are very modest star clusters, but worth observing. And just before we leave the chart, I'm sorry, I'm sort of wandering on here, but before we leave the chart, Frank, if we look to see where Aldebaran is, the bright orange giant, I have looked at the Hyades cluster, that beautiful V-shaped. Everybody's familiar with the Hyades. I discovered it with my dad's binoculars all those years ago.
Excellent.
And I swept through it with my telescope. But again, haven't slowed down enough and magnified to see, well, what little details am I missing? Well, there is one, and it's the one you see in the chart labeled Struve 559. That is a tiny little binary star, about separation of about 2 arc seconds.
Okay.
But they're equally bright. It's a beautiful little headlight binary star. Needs a fair amount of magnification to resolve that. I can see it in my 120 mil apochromatic refractor. I can resolve it really, any good quality telescope, 4 inches and up will resolve that binary star. And it's just a nice little value added part of the Hyades that I didn't know about for decades. Not until I slowed down and took a closer look. If we move down in the article to those photographs, Frank, of the two open clusters, I can sort of emphasize this even further, that I wrote this cluster up for another magazine many years ago, 1647. And you can tell in the picture that it's a very sparsely, very loose star cluster. And it needs to be seen at very low magnification, or else it sort of breaks apart. But once again, when I checked my notes from 20 years ago, I realized that I didn't look all that closely And there's a nice little double star that you can see in the middle, right smack dab in the center of the cluster called AG311. And these two bright stars that you see at the bottom of the screen, I think the brightest one is around 5th meg or 6th meg, I forget now. Anyway, they're not part of the cluster, they're foreground stars, but they're deeply orange. They're lovely. So
Mm-hmm.
when you look at your telescope, these two stars are your jumping off point for looking at 1647. There's a lovely contrast effect between the orange of those two and the blue-white stars of the cluster. And then in the middle is this nice little binary star. It's a modest effect, but it's pretty.
It's
It's,
beautiful.
and if you go to the next one,
Okay.
to, uh, to 1546, it's the same story. I'm sounding like a broken record here. I think.
All
It's
right.
this is an interesting situation, but again, when we get inside uh, the cluster 1746, um, there is a double star. You see it in lower right center, AG313, and that little double shows up right. It's around ninth magnitude, so you need a little bit of magnification to let that thing pop into view. But it's lovely. And then surrounding AG313 is this, again, a coarse, loose collection of stars. It's just barely a cluster. I don't blame Messier for missing this one. It's not very. But then to the left of it, immediately left, there is a clump of fainter stars that are quite a bit more densely packed.
Yep.
And different star charts label these objects in different ways. This is another one of these parts of the sky that's not extremely well known. It's not been well documented. And so some charts will show this as 1746 alone. Others will say 1746 slash 1758, and some just say 1758. But the received wisdom here, from what I could tell from what little research I did, is that there are two star clusters here.
Mm-hmm. Looks like it.
1546 in the foreground, and then 1758 is adjacent to it visually, but physically speaking, it's in the background.
Right.
It's way, way back there. And making it visually interesting, I'm mixing just science and art here. The science part is that you got two physical clusters of stars that are nowhere near each other in space, but
Right.
look like they're overlapping in the sky. I think that's fascinating. And then the artsy part is that I notice these bright stars on the eastern side of the field that line up as a kind of a fence, I call it Ken's fence. And it's right where the fence turns at a right angle to the right of that is where that little clump of stars is. And you have to get the magnification up. If you're looking at this cluster, in this case with a 10-inch telescope,
Okay.
but I tried it with my smaller scopes. I tried it with an 8-inch, and everything you can see here was visible in the 8-inch. But if you look at just low magnification for 10 seconds, which is how I used to look at star clusters, you'll miss this. Everything I've talked about here, you'll miss it. But if you crank up the power and get in close to inside that circle there, you say, wait a minute, there's a kind of a powdery confection of stars here. What is that? Well, it's a separate star cluster is what it is. I think it's neat. And so that's the kind of, I'm hoping that with each column in our bi-monthly series, Suburban Stargazer, I'm hoping that we can find little oddities amidst the regular stuff, the bright M objects and the better known objects. I'm hoping that we can find something a little odd, a little, the path less well traveled. I have to say, I got a lot of my motivation for this and inspiration for it came from Sue French's long-running Deep Sky Wonders, because she kept uh, happening across really faint, unusual stuff that you can actually see in the scope. It's
Mm-hmm.
obscure, it's not well known, but it is visible. And I said, well, I want to look for my own weird faint stuff, and I'm hoping we can explore some of it in the months to come in this new column. The picturesque, photogenic stuff, but also the more difficult stuff that I hope is visible.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, I like this new column. Very good. Off the beaten track. It requires a little patience, but it can be a hunt. It's very cool.
One
Very
of the
nice.
things I should, just before I forget, for those watching this today and leafing through the magazine, is that, when you see the telescope over my shoulder here, it reminds me that I'm going to try wherever possible to get as many different looks as I can, not using just a telescope, but a suite of scopes. I collect scopes the way some people collect stamps. It's awful. My office is cluttered with them. I've got the Mac passes, so you can't see it. It's just beneath my desk here in an airtight container. And if you look, I don't know if I can turn my chair properly to do this enough. What the cylindrical black bag at the bottom there? It looks like
Yes, I see it.
a carrying case for a bass drum. Well, that's because it is a carrying case for a bass drum, except it doesn't have a drum inside. It's got the front end cage of my 18-inch reflector. That's where I store the eyepiece end of the 18-inch. All these delicate optics are properly protected in my office here, except for the main part of the 18-inch, which is in my garage, taking its punishment today as the rain comes pouring down outside. But the humidity is 150%.
Yep.
But the point I want to make is I try to use all these scopes at one time or another. I can't use them all at once every time. There's not space. But one column I'll use a 10-inch, next time I'll use an 8, then I'll use the refractor another time. Either the achromat that you see here or the apachromat. But the idea, what I want to hope can happen is that the reader eventually, after reading a number of our Suburban Stargazer columns, the reader, whatever kind of equipment they're using, they'll recognize themselves in the article. They'll say, wait a minute, I've got a scope that's like that. Maybe not exactly the same, but I have a scope that's roughly that size. I can get that magnification. I can see down to magnitude 4.5 in my backyard. Maybe I can see what he's talking about. And that's what I'm trying to do. So in the January column, mostly it was the 10-inch reflector with a few notes from my refractor. For March, it's almost exclusively a smaller scope. That I don't know if you can see it or not. Where did it go? Oh, there it is. I'm sorry, I'm turned around. On the extreme right-hand side of the screen, on a shelf, you can see lying down sideways.
Yep.
That's my 4.25-inch reflector.
Okay. Yep.
That's home built. That was built by Gary Saronic, one of the editing for the magazine, and he gave that telescope to me. He didn't realize at the time, but he was giving it to me on permanent loan. I've had it for quite a few years, and my March column makes extensive use of that telescope where we look at the clusters M44 and M67 in Cancer. And in May, we'll be looking at the what I call the Big Bear pair, the galaxies M81 and M82, and Ursa Major, through a variety of scopes, trying to see, I won't give away too much of it, but Frank, I'm warning you in advance that when we get to M81 and M82, we're going to be looking for stuff that's right in the same immediate neighborhood, that's hiding in plain sight. Sorry, I'm just adjusting my pillow here. That's hiding in plain sight. That I had never noticed. Decades of observing. Can go straight to the galaxies, observes them, and then goes on and does something else. But there are some interesting stars in the area around M81 and M82, and in fact, other galaxies that are faint, but which I can see from my backyard, and I hope that you can see from your backyard. So
very cool.
Coming up in the May issue.
Very cool. Well, I think we're going to. I think we'll have to be revisiting your column here in a couple of months so we can sort of give a synopsis of what's been seen over the last 4 columns and what scopes you've used to look at stuff and what you've looked at. And yeah, very nice. Well, Ken, I want to thank you so much for spending some time talking about your background, talking about your Orion's District article and your very first column on the Stargazer.
Well, Frank, it's my very great pleasure to do so. I'll tell you what I'll do between now and the next time we talk. I'll try to rearrange things in my office, see if anyone notices. That what you see there is the nicest part of my office. The rest of it is way worse. So, but I'll move the books around or my CD collection or something.
Yeah, you can put another scope on there. There we go.
Yeah.
On display. You'll have a nice little office for videos to show. Very cool. All righty, everyone. Thank you so much. And we will see you on the next Sky and Telescope Author Series. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.